Now I'm going to introduce to you movement biofeedback. Now, movement biofeedback is another example, or is an example of augmented feedback. So what this means is that we have a screen with an object, and small movements or movements of a joint can be picked up by the movement biofeedback or ergonomic wearable devices. And these are translated to movement of an object on the screen. So we can get a patient to move their joint in a direction where the instructions are on the screen. For instance, we can have the patient seeing their movement by seeing themselves moving an object. And like any gaming situation, we can give them a target that they have to reach. So we can get them to see their movements in a vertical direction, or a horizontal direction, or a rotational direction. So this allows them to be able to understand movements. So when they're moving, for example, their wrist into extension, they can see an object moving. If their wrist is moving into extension from left to right, they can, like for instance, like so, we can make sure that the object is moving from left to right. Or if they're moving their wrist up, we can make the object moving up and down. Now this is augmented because small movements of a joint can be portrayed on the screen as big movements, or as larger movements, or as larger movements as we want, or as much of a distance traveled on the screen as we want. So that's an example of augmented feedback, because for instance, a small angular movement of the wrist will not be represented by a small angular movement on the screen, but it could be represented by a large movement of two objects on the screen. So movement biofeedback and augmented biofeedback allows me to provide instructions to the patient of where I want their joint to move to. And it allows me to put this into a gaming format, which allows for encouragement. So what we achieve is encouragement and motivation to do massed and customized repetitions of customized practice. When I'm talking about customization, I'm talking about being able to customize the practice to a particular joint, to a particular range of motion, to a particular speed of movement, a particular coordination of joints as well, so that we can then repeat these specific isolated movements. Now, if we repeat repetitive isolated movement, that's an example of impairment-orientated training. If we make this into a functional movement, for instance, we repeat the same, let's say, the same wrist extension and flexion, but by holding a cup, then we have an example of task-orientated training. So we can customize this to the objectives that the therapist wants to achieve. For instance, they want to achieve a grip, they want to achieve increasing the range of motion. But we can also customize it to the ability of the patient. How much wrist movement? What is the range of motion that the patient can achieve? So we can then customize these tasks to both our objectives and the patient's movement ability. So the patient's movement ability in terms of range of motion, in terms of how accurate they can move, in terms of whether they can reach the limit and hold the limits of their movement ability, whether they can incorporate these movements into functional training. And obviously, if we can then customize these tasks to their ability, and our goal is to increase the ability, we can customize the training as well to our functional goals. So if we have a look at the 4 basic principles of active training in physical rehabilitation, we see that customizing the practice is very, very important. And being able to customize this practice allows us to give motivation to the patients, because they can see that they can achieve it. They can achieve it with their movement ability. They can see that they're achieving their goals. So that gives us the ability to motivate. We can also give them feedback on the progress, how well they're doing, whether they've achieved the task as well, whether they've actually got to the object, how they've got to the object. So their quality of movements within the task. So this is an example of us giving them feedback. And obviously we want to encourage and motivate them to do intensive repetitions of practice. And of course we want to be able to document this and be able to see their improvements. So that allows us to do objective evaluations. So you can see that movement biofeedback and doing it with a dedicated software and in a gaming environment fulfills these 4 criteria of active training in physical rehabilitation.